David H. Marshall Jr. and his father came face to face, as in up close and personal, with something unexplainable in November of 1959 when the two of them were hunting ducks near an abandoned cranberry bog in Evesham Township in Marlton. And he swears to God he witnessed the Jersey Devil. And he has to. He was trained as a pediatric hospital chaplain and a graduate of 2 schools of religious Christian education. Today he runs a construction company that has set up recreation therapy centers in hospitals. He's taught over 7,000 kids and was a scout leader. In other words, he's more than credible when it comes to telling a truthful story. His story goes like this. When I was 12 years old, I had taken a course in hunter safety in Gibbsboro, New Jersey, where my father was a member. It was the first day of hunting season in November of 1959. My father and I were looking for a place to go hunting, so we got our guns and we chose to go out to Kenilworth Road in Marlton. The road eventually tapered off to some old cranberry bogs. We knew there were small ponds around the area, and we thought we'd find some rabbits or geese or ducks. When we got there, we walked through 2 dry bogs that had long been abandoned. At the end of the second bog, there was a pond that had an embankment about 3 feet around it, and was about 75 feet wide and maybe 50 feet long. There were tall pines about 30 feet beyond the pond. These trees were tall, even by Pine Barren standards. The sun had just come up, but we had to wait for a certain time before we were allowed to hunt. I think it was sometime around 6:30 a.m. We walked up the embankment to look at the pond. It was covered in ground fog, so neither my father nor I could see the water. Our guns were taken off the safety, and I said to my dad, "If there's ducks in there, we can't even see them." I wasn't sure how high the water was, but the fog came right up to the embankment. Suddenly, the fog sort of lifted up, like a big hump, and instantaneously, 2 gray wings appeared out of the fog. They looked to be about 12 feet across. The wings had claws on the corners. They were like 2 little black fingernails, one on each corner. This creature's wings came up, and it looked like it was rising them above its shoulders. The fog kind of slid down the claws to this thing's body. Its body was low, but the wings were now getting higher out of the water. They looked like bat wings. And the wings started beating slowly. Up, down, up, down. I couldn't see the center part of the body initially. All of a sudden, it rose out of the water and the fog kind of slid off of his back. At this point, we were both only 10 feet away from this thing. It felt like I was captured in time. One of those moments where you can remember everything. As it moved upwards, out of the water, I could see all the details. Its body was a silver gray color. I didn't see its face, because it had its back to us. But I did see the sharp impression of its shoulder blades. They were projecting up out of its skin. I was so close to this thing that I could see the wings were thin, like the membranes of the skin, and they were serrated. You could actually see through them. The sun was now bouncing the light through them. It didn't have feathers. It had a kind of moleskin that was fuzzy. I was so close, I could see the fuzz on its body. This thing is lumbering in the ground fog. Then, it just takes off. It gets about 8 feet off the ground and approaches the tree line. By the time it gets to the trees, he's about 10 to 12 feet off the ground. Simultaneously, as it gets up to the trees, he turns sideways. The tip of his lower wing is about 3 feet off the ground. He goes into the pine woods sideways and weaves between the trees and disappears. It never rose above the trees. But I remember the whoosh, whoosh sound of the wings. When it was gone, I remember the water from the pond lapping up onto the embankment. It was definitely standing in the water, crouching down when we approached it before it took off. Now, my father and I were standing there with loaded guns, but we were kind of frozen. I looked at him, and the only thing I could say was, "Did you see that?" "Yeah," he said. "Can I tell you what I saw?" "Yeah." Right there, we decided to use common things to remember what it looked like. Its body was the thickness of a telephone pole, about 5 feet long. The body shape was what I described as a Philly blunt cigar, tapered at the back end. It was flying away from us, so like I said, we only saw its back, and I couldn't see its head. It looked like it had its head tucked up underneath its shoulders, and its legs up underneath it too. And I remember saying, "Where were its head and feet?" Now, herons and egrets, they fly with their heads in, and their legs tucked in too. I remember saying to my father, "He looks just like a Philly blunt cigar." The body was cylindrical, but you could see where its hips were. This thing was definitely real. After we both confirmed what we saw, I told my father, "Let's go tell someone." And my father said, "We're not going to tell anyone, because I'm a very high security position." You see, at the time, my father worked for security and audit for the Undersecretary of the Army in the Department of Defense. He was involved in DEFCON, and he may have been getting ready to take over as chief account at an airbase. So he said we were never going to tell anybody. I was heartbroken, but what could I do? He told me this wouldn't fly well. They would think I was nuts. When I was older, I became a scoutmaster and would start to tell the story to the scouts. I would stand there with a Bible and say, "Hi, I'm David Marshall, and I'm a graduate of Christian education, and I'm going to put my hand on this Bible, and I'm going to swear to tell you about my father and I's encounter. An encounter we had with the Jersey Devil." My father would never admit to it. My children knew the story, but we would never ever put it in print. As scoutmaster, one time we brought the scouts to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. There was a new exhibition of dinosaurs. We walked in, and hanging from the ceiling were 2 pterodactyls, one about 8 feet across and the other about 12 feet across. I looked up, froze, and said, "That's it. That's what I saw." The other scout leader with me said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "That's what I saw when I was 12 years old." I spoke with the curator and told him my story. He started to shred everything about my story and challenged everything I told him. The conversation started to get ugly, and I was starting to look like a village idiot. He was destroying everything that I was telling him about what I saw. He kept saying, "It had feathers, right?" And I kept saying, "No." So that was sort of the tone of the conversation. At the end, his tone changed, and he said, "Mr. Marshall, I want to tell you something. I've been pretty rough on you, and I did it for good reason. You have given me the clearest descriptive analysis of what the Jersey Devil really is. No one has ever come forth with a better explanation." He said it was consistent with what other people reported. But the details I gave him were the clearest that he's ever heard. Then he said, "The only other question I have for you is why didn't you call the Institute the next day? You could have called and not said your name or your father's name. We would have had 300 people on the ground and in helicopters combing through that area of Burlington County, and I would have been one of them." All I could tell him was, I was just a kid, and I was doing what my father told me. My father waited until he was 92 years old to tell his story. All those years, he refused to say anything. I guess he figured it was safe now. One of my customer's sons told me he had to do a senior research project and thought maybe my father would talk to him about it. He approached my father and said, "Mr. Marshall, your son has been telling his Jersey Devil story for years, and he said you were standing right there with him. And at some point, you were going to talk about it. Would you mind if I interviewed you? And my father said, to my surprise, yeah, I think it's time to talk about it. I don't think I'll get in trouble anymore. The only difference between my story and my father's story was the wingspan. He claimed it was the width of a street, maybe 16 to 18 feet wide. During the research project, I went back to the place with the student to show him where I saw it. In 1959, it was called Tomlinson Mill Road, but now it's divided between Kenilworth Road and Tomlinson Mill Road. There's still a few remnants of cranberry bogs out there, but where I encountered the Jersey Devil is now a landfill and fenced off, so we couldn't go any further into where I saw it. The research paper is now a permanent collection in the Haddonfield High School, along with the interview tapes of my father. Thank you for taking the time to read this and to share it with your creatures of the night.